In the winter of 1887, Scotland Yard sealed away a case file that would remain classified for over 90 years. The file contained detailed accounts of 7 brutal murders that terrorized London's affluent Belgravia district for 8 months, each victim found with an identical carving on their chest and traces of an unknown substance that left them with frozen expressions of twisted laughter. What made these killings particularly disturbing wasn't just their methodical nature, but the fact that witnesses consistently described hearing genuine, echoing laughter coming from the victims' homes hours after their deaths had been confirmed by the police surgeon. The case was abruptly closed when the lead investigator, Inspector Edmund Harwick, vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a cryptic note that read, "The laughter never stops. It follows you home." Before we continue with the story of London's most chilling unsolved mystery, make sure to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what country or city you're watching from. Stories like these remind us that darkness can lurk anywhere in history's shadows. What the authorities buried wasn't just evidence of a killer's twisted methodology, but proof of how far Victorian society's elite would go to protect their reputations, even when it meant allowing a murderer to walk free through the fog-shrouded streets of the empire's capital. London in 1887 was the beating heart of the largest empire the world had ever known. Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee that year had celebrated 50 years of her reign, with elaborate parades down the Mall and festivities that lasted for weeks. The city had never seemed more prosperous or powerful, its influence stretching from the tea plantations of Ceylon to the diamond mines of South Africa. Gas lamps flickered along the cobblestone streets like earthbound stars, casting dancing shadows between the grand Georgian terraces and the newer Victorian mansions that housed Britain's industrial aristocracy. The very air of London carried the weight of empire, the sweet smoke of coal fires mixing with the salt breeze from the Thames, the distant clatter of hansom cabs over cobblestones, and the constant hum of a city that never truly slept. By day, the streets bustled with merchants, clerks, and servants hurrying about their business, their footsteps echoing off the limestone facades of buildings that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the grey English sky. By night, the city transformed into something altogether more mysterious, its gas-lit streets creating pools of yellow light separated by vast stretches of impenetrable shadow. Belgravia had emerged as the most fashionable district for London's newly wealthy families, a carefully planned neighborhood of pristine white stucco townhouses and garden squares that spoke of refined taste and substantial fortune. Unlike the old aristocracy with their ancestral estates in the countryside, these were the railroad barons, textile magnates, and shipping tycoons who had built their fortunes during the Industrial Revolution. Their elaborate townhouses, with their pristine facades, wrought iron balconies, and meticulously maintained front gardens, stood as monuments to Britain's global dominance and the new wealth it had created. The Harrington family controlled vast cotton mills stretching across Manchester and Lancashire, their factories employing thousands of workers whose labor had built the family fortune. Lord Charles Harrington, a man of imposing presence with steel-grey whiskers and eyes that missed nothing, had purchased his Belgrave Square mansion for the astronomical sum of £12,000, a price that reflected not just the property's grandeur, but the social status it conferred. Lady Margaret Harrington, 20 years his junior and possessed of the refined beauty that came from a lifetime of privilege, hosted elaborate dinner parties that brought together politicians, businessmen, and cultural figures from across the empire. While the Cavendish dynasty had made their millions importing tea and opium from the Far East, their clipper ships racing across the Indian Ocean loaded with precious cargo that filled London's warehouses and lined their family coffers. The youngest Cavendish brother, Geoffrey, had inherited not only substantial wealth, but also the family's appreciation for the finer things in life: art, literature, music, and most particularly, the theatre. His Chester Square residence was known throughout London's cultural circles for its intimate salons, where writers, actors, and intellectuals gathered to discuss the latest artistic movements sweeping across Europe. The Pemberton family fortune came from coal mines that honeycombed the hills of Wales and northern England, their black gold feeding the steam engines that powered Britain's industrial might. Lord William Pemberton, despite his rough beginnings as a miner's son, had transformed himself into one of London's most respected businessmen. though he never quite lost the trace of his working-class accent that marked him as nouveau riche among the established aristocracy. Inspector Edmund Harwick of Scotland Yard had been patrolling these privileged streets for 15 years, rising through the ranks from a common constable, walking the dangerous beats of Whitechapel, to one of the Metropolitan Police's most respected detectives. At 45, he possessed the methodical mind of a true Victorian gentleman, educated at a grammar school that had taught him to read Latin and Greek alongside his police training. His colleagues knew him as a man who could move comfortably among the upper classes when duty required, yet never forgot his own humble origins as the son of a Hampshire blacksmith. Harwick's appearance reflected his dual nature, tall and lean with prematurely grey hair that gave him an air of distinguished authority, yet his hands remained calloused from his youth spent working in his father's forge. His dark eyes held the steady gaze of a man who had seen humanity at its worst, yet maintained enough optimism to believe that justice could still prevail. He lived alone in modest lodgings on Montague Street near the British Museum, a bachelor who had devoted his life entirely to his work, finding companionship in the books that lined his small sitting room and the occasional evening spent at his local public house discussing cases with fellow officers. The autumn of 1887 had been particularly harsh, with early frost appearing in Hyde Park by the first week of October, and thick yellow fogs rolling off the Thames to settle over the city like a suffocating blanket. These weren't the romantic mists of poetry, but the choking pea-soupers that came from countless coal fires mixing with the natural fog off the river. The smoke-laden air could reduce visibility to mere yards, turning familiar streets into alien landscapes where even lifelong Londoners lost their way. On particularly foggy nights, the gas lamps seemed to float in space like disembodied spirits, their feeble light creating more shadows than illumination. The clip-clop of horses' hooves on cobblestones would emerge from the murk without warning, followed by the ghostly shape of a hansom cab, materializing and disappearing again into the gloom. It was said that Jack the Ripper himself would begin using these fogs to his advantage in the East End, though those murders lay nearly a year in the future. For now, in Belgravia, the wealthy felt safe behind their locked doors and uniformed servants, protected by their money and social position from the violence that plagued the poorer districts. That sense of security, built on privilege and social position, would prove to be fatally misplaced. For in the fog-shrouded streets of Victorian London, death could take any form, even that of laughter echoing through the darkness long after its source had been silenced forever. October 15th, 1887. The scream that shattered the pre-dawn quiet on Belgrave Square came from Lady Margaret Harrington, who had returned early from a charity gala at the Royal Opera House to find her front door standing ajar, letting the thick autumn fog swirl through her marble-floored entrance hall like ghostly fingers exploring a tomb. The fog that night had been particularly dense, one of those suffocating London pea-soupers that transformed the familiar into the alien. Gas lamps along the square created small pools of sickly yellow light, but beyond their feeble reach lay an impenetrable wall of grey-green mist that seemed to muffle sound and distort distance. Lady Margaret's hansom cab had been forced to proceed at walking pace, the driver calling out warnings to other traffic that might be hidden in the murk. She had left the opera early, pleading a headache to her companions, though in truth she had grown weary of the evening's entertainment, a tedious performance of Wagner that seemed to drone on interminably. The charity gala was one of those obligatory social functions that came with her position in society, an opportunity for London's wealthy to see and be seen while making token contributions to worthy causes. She had worn her finest emerald silk gown, the one that complemented her auburn hair and made her green eyes sparkle in the gaslight. But by the second act, she found herself longing for the comfort of her own drawing room and a cup of properly prepared tea. The journey home through the fog-shrouded streets had taken nearly twice as long as usual, the familiar landmarks of Belgravia rendered invisible by the thick mist. Street after street looked identical in the murk, and even her experienced driver had been forced to stop twice to get his bearings by reading street signs in the dim glow of the gas lamps. The fog seemed to press against the windows of the cab like a living thing, and Lady Margaret found herself grateful for the warmth of her ermine opera cloak and the familiar sound of the horses' hooves on cobblestones. When they finally reached Belgrave Square, Lady Margaret noticed immediately that something was wrong. The front door of her townhouse stood slightly open, a rectangle of warm gaslight from the entrance hall spilling out into the fog like a golden invitation. This was unprecedented. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, her head housekeeper, was known throughout the household for her rigid adherence to proper security procedures. Never in 23 years of faithful service had she left a door unlocked, let alone standing open to the London night. Lady Margaret's first thought was that perhaps Mrs. Whitfield had been taken ill and needed immediate medical attention. The housekeeper was approaching 60 and had been showing signs of the fatigue that came with age and a lifetime of hard work. Just the previous week, she had seemed unusually distracted, talking to herself more frequently than usual as she went about her duties. The other servants had mentioned hearing her engaged in what seemed like animated conversations in empty rooms, though when questioned, Mrs. Whitfield had simply smiled and claimed she was practicing elocution exercises. As Lady Margaret climbed the steps to her front door, her silk evening slippers clicking against the wet stone, she called out softly, "Mrs. Whitfield, Eleanor, are you quite well?" The fog seemed to swallow her voice, making even her own words sound strange and distant. The gas jets in the entrance hall flickered as the night air swirled through the open door, creating dancing shadows on the polished marble floor and the gilt-framed portraits that lined the walls. Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, the Harrington family's head housekeeper of 23 years, lay sprawled across the Persian carpet in the main drawing room, her body positioned with an almost theatrical precision that would haunt Lady Margaret for the rest of her days. Her silver hair, usually pinned back in a severe bun that reflected her no-nonsense approach to household management, had been carefully arranged around her head like a halo, each strand placed with deliberate artistry. Her weathered hands, which had scrubbed countless floors and polished endless pieces of silver during her decades of service, were folded peacefully across her chest in the manner of a proper Christian burial. But it was her face that transformed the scene from tragedy into nightmare. Mrs. Whitfield's features were frozen in an expression of such genuine, rapturous laughter that it seemed like a mockery of death itself. Her mouth was open wide in what appeared to be a moment of absolute joy, her eyes crinkled with the kind of genuine mirth that usually accompanied the most delightful surprise. The effect was so lifelike that for a moment Lady Margaret actually expected to hear the sound of her housekeeper's distinctive laugh echoing through the drawing room. The room itself showed signs of a violent struggle that contrasted horribly with the victim's peaceful final expression. Furniture had been overturned. A valuable Chinese vase lay shattered near the fireplace, and books from the mahogany shelves were scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The heavy velvet curtains had been torn down from one window, and Lady Margaret's collection of delicate porcelain figurines lay broken among the cushions of the horsehair sofa. Inspector Harwick arrived as the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the fog, accompanied by the familiar sounds of London awakening, the distant call of milk vendors beginning their rounds, the clip-clop of early morning traffic, and the gradual increase in street noise that marked the transition from night to day. The inspector's tall, lean figure cut an imposing silhouette as he emerged from the fog, his dark overcoat and bowler hat making him appear like a character from one of the Gothic novels that had become so popular among London's reading public. The scene was unlike anything Harwick had witnessed in his long career with Scotland Yard, and he had seen enough violence to fill several lifetimes. Mrs. Whitfield's body showed clear evidence of a prolonged and violent struggle. Her fingernails were torn and caked with what appeared to be her attacker's skin and blood. Purple bruises encircled her throat like a necklace of violence, and defensive wounds along her forearms told the story of a woman who had fought desperately for her life. Yet her face displayed that unnaturally perfect expression of joy, as if she had died while witnessing something wonderfully amusing. "Blimey, sir," whispered Constable James Thornbury, Harwick's young assistant, as he knelt beside the corpse with the queasy expression of a man seeing his first truly disturbing crime scene. Thornbury was barely 22, fresh from training at Scotland Yard, and still adjusting to the grim realities of police work in Victorian London. Look at her expression, Inspector. What manner of madman could do such a thing? It's almost as if she died laughing. Inspector Harwick examined the scene with his characteristic attention to detail, moving through the drawing room like a methodical scientist cataloguing evidence. Every overturned piece of furniture, every scattered book, every broken ornament told part of the story of Mrs. Whitfield's final moments. He noted the positioning of the body, the careful arrangement of her hair, the deliberate folding of her hands, all suggesting that the killer had spent considerable time with the victim after her death, staging the scene for maximum psychological impact. The killer had carved a small but precise symbol into the victim's chest, just below her left collarbone, a theatrical mask that combined both comedy and tragedy in a single disturbing image. The kind of mask used in the grand theatres of the West End, where London's cultural elite gathered to see the latest productions by Shaw, Wilde, and other contemporary playwrights. The wound was shallow and clearly made after death, the edges clean and purposeful rather than frenzied. This was intended as the murderer's calling card rather than a fatal blow, a signature that spoke of planning and deliberation rather than sudden violence. But it was the peculiar, cloying scent that permeated the drawing room that troubled Inspector Harwick most deeply. Not the usual odors of death and decay that he had learned to expect at crime scenes, but something almost medicinal, with a sweet undertone that reminded him of the ether used by surgeons at St. Bartholomew's Hospital. Yet this was more complex and deliberately crafted, with layers of different chemical scents that suggested sophisticated knowledge of pharmacology and chemistry. He had encountered similar chemical odors during a case 3 years earlier involving a disgraced physician who had been conducting illegal experiments with anesthetics on charity patients at Bethlem Royal Hospital. That case had ended with the doctor's suicide and the destruction of his research, but the memory of those strange, sweet smells had lingered in Harwick's mind like an unwelcome ghost. This was different, though. More sophisticated, more purposeful, suggesting someone with advanced knowledge of chemical compounds and their effects on the human body. Lady Margaret Harrington, still wrapped in her ermine opera cloak and trembling despite the warmth from the coal fire that one of the servants had hastily lit, could provide little useful information about the events leading up to the discovery. "I returned from the Royal Opera House shortly after midnight," she explained in her cultured accent, her voice barely above a whisper as she struggled to maintain the composure expected of a woman of her social standing. "We attended a charity gala. Rather a dreadful performance of Wagner's Ring Cycle, if I'm being honest. I pleaded a headache and left early around 11:30. She paused, dabbing at her eyes with a delicate lace handkerchief embroidered with her family's coat of arms. Eleanor should have been abed hours ago. She was always so proper about keeping to her schedule, retiring each night at precisely 10 o'clock after ensuring that all the doors were locked and the gas jets properly extinguished. She had been with our family since before my marriage to Lord Charles, and never once in all those years had she deviated from her established routines. What Lady Margaret couldn't explain, and what would later become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case, was the strange detail that several neighbours would mention to Inspector Harwick in hushed, nervous tones over the following days. Mrs. Gertrude Pembroke, who lived in the townhouse directly across the square, reported that she had heard the unmistakable sound of a woman's laughter coming from the Harrington residence well past 2 in the morning, hours after the police surgeon had confirmed Mrs. Whitfield's time of death as occurring between 11:30 and midnight. "It was the most peculiar thing, Inspector," Mrs. Pembroke explained when Harwick called upon her the following afternoon. She was a matronly woman in her 60s, the widow of a successful barrister who had left her comfortably situated in one of Belgravia's finest addresses. "I was reading in my front sitting room. I suffer from insomnia, you understand, and often find myself unable to sleep until the early morning hours. The fog was so thick that I could barely see across the square, but sound carries strangely on such nights." She settled her ample form more comfortably in her velvet armchair, her fingers nervously working at the fringe of her cashmere shawl. "At first I thought perhaps Lady Margaret was entertaining late guests. Sometimes the upper classes keep rather unconventional hours, especially after attending the theatre. But this laughter was different, Inspector. It went on for nearly an hour. the same woman's voice laughing again and again with such joy that it almost made me smile to hear it. Yet there was something unsettling about it as well, something that made me close my curtains and try to put it from my mind. The first victim had been claimed by what the newspapers would soon christen the Laughing Man, though the killer's identity and motives remained as mysterious as the fog that shrouded the gaslit streets of Victorian London. Inspector Harwick found himself facing not just a murder investigation, but a puzzle that seemed to challenge the very foundations of rational thought and scientific understanding. Word of the brutal murder spread through Belgravia's social circles like wildfire, despite the Harrington family's desperate attempts to maintain discretion and protect their reputation from the taint of scandal. Within days, the drawing rooms and private clubs of London's elite buzzed with whispered conversations about the unfortunate incident at the Harrington residence, with each retelling adding new details and wild speculations that bore little resemblance to the actual facts of the case. The Times, ever mindful of its responsibility to London's respectable classes, ran only a brief, carefully worded notice about a domestic tragedy in Belgrave Square, providing just enough information to satisfy public curiosity while avoiding the sensational details that might disturb proper society. The article, buried on page 6 between advertisements for patent medicines and notices of upcoming charity events, simply stated that Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a long-time servant in the household of Lord and Lady Harrington, had been found deceased under circumstances that were being investigated by the Metropolitan Police. However, the more sensational penny papers seized upon the story, with characteristic Victorian appetite for scandal and Gothic horror. The Illustrated Police News, with its lurid woodcut illustrations and breathless prose, splashed the story across its front page under the headline, "Mysterious Death in Belgravia, Servant Found with Ghastly Smile." The accompanying illustration, though wildly inaccurate in its details, captured something of the disturbing nature of the crime and helped to cement the case in the public imagination. Inspector Harwick found himself walking a delicate political tightrope that required all of his diplomatic skills and understanding of Victorian social hierarchy. The Harrington family wielded considerable influence throughout London's corridors of power. Lord Charles Harrington not only sat in the House of Lords, but held substantial investments in railways across the empire and maintained close friendships with several members of Parliament. A single word from him could end a police career in disgrace, or conversely, launch an ambitious detective toward the upper echelons of Scotland Yard and a comfortable pension. Yet Harwick's sense of justice, honed by 15 years of police work in London's toughest neighbourhoods, demanded a thorough investigation regardless of social consequences. He had seen too many cases where wealth and privilege had bought silence and allowed criminals to escape justice. Mrs. Whitfield, despite her humble position as a servant, deserved the same careful attention to her murder as would be given to any member of the aristocracy. The inspector's initial inquiries into Mrs. Whitfield's background revealed a woman who had lived an exemplary life of service and devotion to her employers. Born Eleanor Caldwell in a small village in Yorkshire, she had come to London as a young woman of 18 to seek employment in one of the capital's grand houses. Through hard work, natural intelligence, and an innate understanding of the complex social dynamics that governed Victorian household management, she had risen from scullery maid to head housekeeper over the course of 2 decades. The other servants in the Harrington household spoke of Mrs. Whitfield with genuine affection and respect. Sarah Pembroke, the young scullery maid whose nervous demeanour reflected the trauma of discovering her superior's body, described a woman who had been both stern taskmaster and benevolent mentor. "She was always fair with us, was Mrs. Whitfield," Sarah explained, her voice barely above a whisper as she twisted her starched white apron between her trembling fingers. "Never raised her voice without cause, and always willing to teach you the proper way of doing things if you showed willing to learn." Thomas Hartwell, the Harrington family's butler and Mrs. Whitfield's closest colleague among the household staff, painted a picture of a woman who took enormous pride in her work and had dedicated her entire adult life to the smooth operation of the household. "She knew every detail of this house, Inspector," he said, his formal bearing softening slightly as he spoke of his departed colleague. Every piece of silver, every bit of china, every family tradition and social obligation. Lady Margaret relied on her completely, as did Lord Charles. She was more than a servant. She was the heart of this household. Yet despite this glowing testimonial to her character and competence, the servants also revealed that Mrs. Whitfield had displayed some unusual behaviors in the weeks leading up to her death. Several mentioned her increasing tendency to engage in what seemed like elaborate conversations with invisible companions as she went about her daily duties. She was always one for dramatics, was Mrs. Whitfield, explained Sarah Pembroke, her voice gaining confidence as she warmed to her subject. Sometimes we'd hear her in the pantry or the wine cellar, doing voices like she was putting on a show for someone. Different characters, you see. Sometimes she'd be speaking like a grand lady, all posh and refined, and then she'd switch to a rough working-class accent, then maybe an Irish brogue or a Scottish burr. Made us laugh, it did, hearing her practice all those different ways of speaking. This theatrical connection intrigued Inspector Harwick, particularly given the theatrical mask carved into the victim's chest and the bizarre expression of joy frozen on her face at the moment of death. He began to see a pattern emerging, though its significance remained unclear. Mrs. Whitfield's interest in theatrical performance, her apparent practice of different accents and characters, and the killer's choice of signature all suggested some connection to London's vibrant theatre community. The inspector decided to expand his investigation into London's theatre world, beginning with the grand playhouses of the West End, where London's cultural elite gathered to see the latest productions by celebrated playwrights like Oscar Wilde, George Bernard Shaw, and the emerging generation of realistic dramatists who were challenging Victorian sensibilities with their frank portrayals of social problems. The West End in 1887 was a tight-knit community where gossip travelled quickly among the performers, stage managers, directors and theatre owners who made their living entertaining Victorian society's appetite for dramatic entertainment. The Lyceum Theatre, under the management of the legendary Henry Irving, had become the pinnacle of London theatrical achievement, while newer venues like the Savoy Theatre were experimenting with electric lighting and other technological innovations that promised to revolutionize the theatrical experience. It was during these theatrical inquiries that Inspector Harwick first heard whispers of a mysterious figure who had been frequenting the music halls and legitimate theatres alike. A well-dressed gentleman who always attended performances alone, never spoke to anyone, but was occasionally seen laughing with such intensity during inappropriate moments that other patrons found it deeply disturbing. Several theatre managers reported complaints from audience members about this individual's bizarre reactions to dramatic scenes, particularly those involving death, tragedy, or intense emotional content. "Gave me the shivers, something terrible he did," confided Albert Grimsby, manager of the Lyceum Theatre, as he led Inspector Harwick through the empty theatre on a grey November afternoon. The vast auditorium, stripped of its usual evening glamour, seemed almost ghostly in the pale daylight filtering through the tall windows. This gentleman, and he was obviously a gentleman, mind you, from his clothes and bearing, sat in the same box seat for 3 consecutive nights during our production of Macbeth. Every time someone died on stage, every time Lady Macbeth delivered one of her mad scenes, he'd start laughing. Not chuckling or polite applause, you understand, but proper belly laughs that echoed through the entire theatre. Grimsby paused in his narrative, clearly disturbed by the memory even weeks after the incident. The other patrons began to complain, said it was ruining their enjoyment of the performance. Mr. Irving himself noticed from the stage and was quite put out by the disruption. We finally had to ask the gentleman not to return, though he took the request with remarkable good humour, said he understood completely and complimented us on our authentic portrayal of mortality's absurdity. Those were his exact words, Inspector. Not the sort of thing you'd expect to hear from a typical theatre patron. Yet when Harwick pressed the various theatre managers and employees for detailed descriptions of this mysterious figure, the accounts varied significantly and often contradicted each other in ways that suggested either multiple individuals or someone with a remarkable talent for altering his appearance. Some remembered a tall man with dark hair and a prominent moustache, reminiscent of the fashionable style favoured by military officers, while others recalled someone shorter and clean-shaven, with the pale complexion of a scholar or professional man. The only consistent details across all the accounts were that the mysterious patron always wore expensive evening clothes that marked him as a member of the upper classes, seemed to possess intimate knowledge of each performance, as if he had attended rehearsals or studied the scripts in advance, and displayed that disturbing tendency to laugh at moments when any normal person would feel sadness, fear, or dramatic tension. 3 weeks after Mrs. Whitfield's murder, as London's fog grew thicker with the approaching winter and the gas lamps seemed to burn with increasing desperation against the encroaching darkness, the killer struck again. This time, the victim was Mr. Geoffrey Cavendish, the younger brother of the tea importing dynasty, found dead in his private study in Chester Square under circumstances that were both similar to and distinctly different from the first murder. The discovery was made by Mr. Cavendish's manservant, a nervous young man named William Hartley, who had been in the gentleman's employ for less than 6 months. Hartley had arrived at the usual hour of 7 in the morning to light the fires and prepare his master's breakfast, only to find the study door locked from the inside and no response to his increasingly frantic knocking. When the door was finally forced open by a locksmith summoned by the household's cook, the scene that greeted them was one that would be seared into their memories forever. Mr. Geoffrey Cavendish sat upright in his favorite leather armchair, a massive piece of furniture positioned beside the fireplace where he customarily spent his evenings reading and correspondence. He was dressed in his burgundy velvet smoking jacket and appeared at first glance to be merely sleeping, his head tilted back against the chair's high back and his hands resting comfortably on the armrests. But like Mrs. Whitfield before him, his face was frozen in that same expression of ecstatic, rapturous laughter that seemed to mock the very concept of death itself. The study itself told a different story than the first crime scene. Where Mrs. Whitfield's death had occurred during a violent struggle that left the Harrington drawing room in shambles, Mr. Cavendish appeared to have died peacefully, almost as if he had simply succumbed to an overwhelming fit of mirth while reading. The room remained perfectly ordered, with not a single book out of place on the mahogany shelves that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A leather-bound volume lay open in the dead man's lap, a collection of comedic plays by the contemporary playwright Oscar Wilde, open to a page containing dialogue from The Importance of Being Earnest. The irony was not lost on Inspector Harwick, who noted that the open page contained Lady Bracknell's famous line about the importance of maintaining proper composure in the face of life's trials and tribulations. But the most disturbing detail, one that would haunt Inspector Harwick for months to come, was revealed by the other residents of Chester Square, who had been awakened during the night by sounds coming from the Cavendish residence. Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton, an elderly widow who lived in the adjoining townhouse, reported hearing laughter echoing through the walls well past 3 in the morning, hours after the police surgeon would later determine that Mr. Cavendish had died sometime between 10 and 11 o'clock the previous evening. "It was the strangest thing, Inspector," Mrs. Pemberton explained when Harwick interviewed her the following day. She was a dignified woman in her 70s, the relict of a successful shipping merchant who had left her well provided for in one of London's most prestigious addresses. "The walls between our houses are quite thick. They were built to ensure privacy for families of quality. Yet I could hear this gentleman's laughter as clearly as if he was sitting in my own drawing room." She paused to pour tea from an elaborate silver service, her hands trembling slightly with age or nervousness. "What troubled me most was the duration of it, Inspector. It wasn't the brief amusement one might experience while reading a particularly witty passage. This laughter continued for hours, sometimes stopping for a few minutes only to resume with even greater intensity. I finally took a sleeping powder around 4 in the morning, but even then I could hear it echoing through my dreams." Inspector Harwick's investigation into Geoffrey Cavendish's background revealed a man who moved in entirely different circles from Mrs. Whitfield, making the connection between the victims even more puzzling. Cavendish was a gentleman of independent means, educated at Cambridge University, where he had studied classics and literature, before inheriting a substantial fortune from his family's tea importing business. Unlike his older brother Marcus, who managed the family's commercial interests with ruthless efficiency, Geoffrey had chosen to pursue a life of intellectual and cultural interests. He was a regular patron of London's theatre scene, known throughout the West End as a generous supporter of new playwrights and innovative productions. His Chester Square residence was famous throughout London's cultural circles for its intimate salons where writers, actors, critics, and intellectuals gathered twice weekly to discuss the latest artistic movements sweeping across Europe. Oscar Wilde himself had been a frequent guest, as had George Bernard Shaw, the controversial Irish playwright whose realistic dramas were challenging Victorian sensibilities with their frank portrayals of social problems. Cavendish had never married, preferring to dedicate his life to the pursuit of knowledge and aesthetic experience. His private library contained over 3,000 volumes, covering subjects ranging from classical literature to the latest scientific treatises on human psychology and behavior. He was known among his circle for his particular interest in the emerging field of psychology, especially theories about the relationship between mental states and physical expression. The connection between Mrs. Whitfield and Mr. Cavendish remained elusive despite Inspector Harwick's increasingly desperate efforts to find common ground between the victims. She was a working-class woman who had spent her life in service to others, while he was an educated gentleman who moved among London's cultural elite. Their social worlds rarely intersected, yet both had been killed by the same methodical hand. Both left with that haunting expression of joy, and both had somehow continued laughing hours after their deaths. It was Constable Thornbury, still eager to prove himself despite his queasy reaction to violent crime scenes, who made the breakthrough discovery that would crack the case wide open. While conducting a thorough search of Cavendish's study under Inspector Harwick's supervision, the young constable noticed that the wooden panel behind the gentleman's massive desk seemed slightly loose. Further investigation revealed a secret compartment containing a collection of items that shed an entirely new light on the investigation. Hidden in this concealed space was a small leather diary, its pages filled with Geoffrey Cavendish's precise handwriting, documenting his growing obsession with what he called the authentic expression of human emotion. The diary entries, spanning the previous 6 months, revealed a man who had become increasingly fascinated with the idea that most human expressions of feeling were mere social performances designed to meet the expectations of Victorian society rather than genuine manifestations of inner experience. June 3, 1887, read one particularly revealing entry. Attended the Pembertons' dinner party this evening. Observed Mrs. Harrington's housekeeper, a woman of remarkable theatrical sensibility. While serving the soup course, she displayed what appeared to be genuine amusement at Lady Pemberton's story about her difficulties with her new cook. Unlike the polite, restrained laughter of the dinner guests, this woman's response seemed completely authentic and unfiltered by social convention. Would be most interested to study her reactions under more controlled circumstances. Another entry, dated just 2 weeks before Cavendish's death, was even more disturbing. Have made contact with Dr. H regarding the experiments we discussed. He has agreed to collaborate on our investigation into the chemical induction of authentic emotional states. The preliminary compounds show remarkable promise for overriding the social conditioning that suppresses genuine human response. If successful, we shall finally witness pure, unrestrained emotion in its most natural form. But it was the final entry, written just 2 days before his death, that sent a chill through Inspector Harwick's spine as he read it by the flickering gaslight in Cavendish's study. The work begins tomorrow night. Dr. H has perfected the compound that will allow us to witness genuine human emotion, stripped of all social pretense. I have volunteered to be the first subject, confident that my scientific curiosity will overcome any temporary discomfort. If successful, we shall finally understand what lies beneath the masks we all wear in polite society. The diary revealed that Geoffrey Cavendish had not been a victim at all, but a willing participant in some horrific experiment that had gone catastrophically wrong. But who was this mysterious Dr. H mentioned throughout the entries? And what was the nature of these chemical compounds that could apparently induce such extreme emotional states while simultaneously causing death? Inspector Harwick's mind raced as he considered the implications. If Cavendish had been a willing subject, then Mrs. Whitfield's murder took on an entirely different character. Perhaps she had not been a random victim either, but somehow connected to these experiments in ways that were not yet apparent. The theatrical elements, the carved masks, the frozen expressions of laughter, the continued sounds of mirth hours after death, all suggested a killer with deep knowledge of both chemistry and human psychology. Hidden beneath the diary, Constable Thornbury discovered a collection of correspondence that provided additional clues to the mystery. Letters written in an educated hand and signed only with the initial H discussed complex chemical formulas and theories about the relationship between consciousness and emotional expression. One letter, dated 3 months earlier, was particularly revealing. "My dear Cavendish," it read, "your observations about the artificial nature of social emotion confirm my own research into the chemical basis of human feeling. I believe we are on the verge of a breakthrough that will revolutionize our understanding of consciousness itself. The compounds I have developed can bypass the social conditioning that suppresses authentic response, allowing us to observe pure emotion in its natural state. However, I must caution you that the effects are not yet fully understood, and the dosage requires precise calculation to avoid unintended consequences." As Inspector Harwick read through the correspondence, he began to piece together a picture of systematic experimentation that went far beyond simple murder. Someone with advanced knowledge of chemistry and psychology had been conducting research into the manipulation of human emotion, using London's unsuspecting population as test subjects. The theatrical elements weren't random signatures, but carefully chosen symbols representing the artificial nature of social performance versus authentic emotional expression. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in London's most fashionable district intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this twisted tale of Victorian London. Inspector Harwick realized with growing horror that he was no longer investigating random murders, but systematic human experimentation conducted by someone with sophisticated knowledge of chemistry and psychology. The revelation transformed his entire approach to the case, shifting from hunting a conventional killer to pursuing what amounted to a mad scientist using London's population as laboratory subjects. The inspector's inquiries into Geoffrey Cavendish's intellectual circle led him deep into the shadowy world of Victorian pseudoscience and experimental medicine. London, in 1887, was a hotbed of scientific innovation and speculation, where legitimate research often blurred with quackery, and where ambitious men pushed the boundaries of ethical experimentation in pursuit of fame and discovery. Cavendish had been a member of several intellectual societies that met regularly in the private rooms of gentlemen's clubs throughout London. The Athenaeum Club, with its imposing neoclassical facade overlooking Pall Mall, served as headquarters for the Royal Geographic Society and attracted the most distinguished men of science and letters in the empire. But it was the smaller, more specialized groups that caught Inspector Harwick's attention. Organizations like the Society for Psychical Research and the London Anthropological Institute, where the latest theories about human consciousness and behavior were debated with passionate intensity. Among the regular attendees at these gatherings was Dr. Sebastian Hartwell, a former physician who had been stripped of his medical license 3 years earlier following accusations of conducting unauthorized experiments on patients at Bethlehem Royal Hospital. The infamous Bedlam Asylum, where London's mentally ill were confined under conditions that would have shocked even the callous sensibilities of Victorian society. Dr. Hartwell's fall from grace had been spectacular and well documented in the medical journals of the day. Once considered one of London's most promising young physicians, with a practice in fashionable Harley Street and a reputation for innovative treatments of nervous disorders, he had gradually become obsessed with the physical manifestations of mental states. His research had focused particularly on the facial expressions that accompanied extreme emotions, and he had developed increasingly controversial theories about the possibility of chemically inducing specific psychological states. Hartwell was brilliant, I'll give him that. explained Professor Marcus Rothwell of University College London when Inspector Harwick tracked him down to his cluttered office overlooking Gower Street. Rothwell was himself a respected researcher in the emerging field of experimental psychology and had known Hartwell during their student days at Edinburgh University. But he was utterly without moral constraints when it came to his research. He believed that true scientific progress required experimentation that pushed beyond the boundaries of conventional ethics. The professor paused to clean his spectacles, his scholarly demeanor troubled by memories of his former colleagues' descent into scientific obsession. Hartwell spoke often of developing chemical compounds that could induce specific emotional states while keeping the subject conscious and aware. He was particularly interested in the expression of joy and laughter, believing that genuine happiness was the most difficult emotion to produce artificially. His goal was to create what he called pure emotional experience, stripped of all social conditioning and conscious control. When Inspector Harwick attempted to locate Dr. Hartwell, he discovered that the man had vanished from his modest lodgings in Bloomsbury several weeks earlier, leaving behind only a collection of disturbing notebooks filled with detailed anatomical drawings of facial muscles and chemical formulas that seemed designed to affect the human nervous system. The landlady, Mrs. Agnes Butterworth, reported that her tenant had been conducting strange experiments in his rooms, often working late into the night with chemical apparatus that filled the boarding house with unusual odors. Strange gentleman he was, Mrs. Butterworth explained, as she led Inspector Harwick through the empty rooms that had served as Dr. Hartwell's laboratory and living quarters. Always polite and paid his rent promptly, but there were such peculiar smells coming from his rooms at all hours. Sweet chemical odors that made your eyes water, and sometimes sounds like someone practicing speeches or theatrical performances. The rooms themselves provided disturbing evidence of the scope of Dr. Hartwell's research. Hidden behind a false wall, Inspector Harwick discovered a complete chemical laboratory equipped with glass retorts, heating apparatus, and an extensive collection of bottles containing various powders and liquids. Most troubling were the detailed notes describing experiments with different chemical combinations and their effects on human subjects, though the identity of these subjects remained unclear. One notebook contained precise measurements and observations that chilled Inspector Harwick to the bone. Subject displays involuntary laughter, beginning approximately 15 minutes after administration. Expression becomes increasingly intense over next 30 minutes, reaching peak euphoria at 45-minute mark. Subject remains conscious throughout process but appears unable to control facial muscles or vocalization. Effect persists for approximately 6 hours after cessation of vital functions, suggesting compound affects nervous system on fundamental level. The inspector's sense of urgency intensified when he learned that several more members of Belgravia's elite had reported disturbing incidents in recent days. Lady Victoria Pemberton, the widow who lived near the Cavendish residence, had discovered clear evidence that someone had been in her house during her absence the previous week. Though nothing had been stolen, several items had been moved and rearranged in ways that suggested systematic searching. It was the most unsettling thing, Inspector, Lady Pemberton explained as she served tea in her elegant morning room overlooking Chester Square. I returned from visiting my sister in Brighton to find that someone had been through my private papers. Nothing was missing, you understand, but my desk had been searched and my personal correspondence had been read. Most disturbing of all, several books from my library were missing, all volumes dealing with theatrical performance and the expression of emotion. Lord Hamilton Fairfax, whose mansion on Eaton Square housed one of London's finest private libraries, reported a similar incident. His study had been entered and ransacked, though the intruder had shown remarkable selectivity in what they chose to examine. The fellow seemed to know exactly what he was looking for, Lord Fairfax explained to Inspector Harwick. He ignored the valuable first editions and rare manuscripts that would have been worth a fortune to any common thief. Instead, he took only books dealing with psychology, anatomy, and theatrical performance, most peculiar behavior for a burglar. But it was Mrs. Charlotte Bramwell's experience that provided the most chilling evidence of the killer's methodical approach. The widow of a successful solicitor, Mrs. Bramwell lived alone except for her household staff in a grand townhouse on Belgrave Square, directly across from the Harrington residence where the first murder had occurred. For the past 2 weeks, she had noticed a well-dressed gentleman watching her house from the shadows across the street, always disappearing when she attempted to get a better look at him. "He seemed to be studying the house, Inspector," she explained, her voice trembling with suppressed fear. "Not like a common burglar looking for an opportunity, but more like someone making careful observations for a specific purpose. I began to feel like a specimen being examined under a microscope." Mrs. Bramwell's description of her mysterious observer matched some of the accounts given by theatre managers about the strange patron who laughed inappropriately during dramatic performances. A tall, well-dressed gentleman with the bearing of an educated man, but something unsettling in his manner that made people uncomfortable without being able to identify exactly what disturbed them. Inspector Harwick realized that all of these individuals, Lady Pemberton, Lord Fairfax, and Mrs. Bramwell, shared a crucial connection that chilled him to the bone. They had each attended the same series of lectures on the science of human expression, given by Dr. Sebastian Hartwell at the Royal Institution earlier that year, before his research had been exposed and his medical license revoked. The pattern became even more ominous when Harwick discovered that both Mrs. Whitfield and Geoffrey Cavendish had also attended those same lectures. Mrs. Whitfield, despite her position as a servant, had somehow gained access to the scientific presentations, while Cavendish had been a regular attendee who often engaged the lecturer in detailed discussions after each session. The lectures had been advertised as an exploration of the latest scientific understanding of human emotion and its physical manifestations, drawing audiences from London's intellectual and cultural elite. Dr. Hartwell had used the platform to present his theories about authentic versus artificial emotional expression, arguing that most human feelings were mere social performances rather than genuine psychological states. According to newspaper accounts of the lectures, Dr. Hartwell had been particularly persuasive in his argument that true scientific understanding of human nature required the study of emotion in its pure, unfiltered form. He had suggested that chemical compounds might be developed to bypass social conditioning and reveal the authentic emotional responses that lay buried beneath the veneer of civilized behavior. What none of the audience members had realized was that Dr. Hartwell was not merely presenting theoretical possibilities, but outlining a program of human experimentation that he intended to conduct using members of the audience as unwitting subjects. The killer wasn't choosing victims randomly. He was working methodically through a list of people who had shown interest in his disturbing theories about the manipulation of human emotion. As winter deepened and the London fogs grew thicker, transforming the gaslit streets into a maze of shadows and uncertainty, Inspector Harwick found himself racing against time to protect potential victims while hunting a killer who understood human psychology in ways that defied conventional police methods. The case had evolved far beyond simple murder investigation. It had become a desperate attempt to stop systematic human experimentation conducted by someone who viewed his fellow human beings as nothing more than laboratory specimens. The inspector's investigation revealed that Dr. Hartwell had been preparing for his experiments for months, carefully selecting subjects who had demonstrated interest in his theories and systematically gathering information about their habits, schedules, and vulnerabilities. The theatrical elements, the carved masks, the frozen expressions of laughter, the posthumous sounds of mirth, weren't random signatures, but carefully crafted symbols designed to demonstrate his theories about the artificial nature of social emotion. Each murder was not just an act of violence, but a scientific demonstration intended to prove Dr. Hartwell's theories about authentic emotional expression. The victims weren't dying from conventional violence, but from chemical compounds that induced overwhelming euphoria, while simultaneously causing fatal physiological reactions. The continued laughter heard hours after death wasn't supernatural phenomenon, but evidence of drugs that affected the nervous system so profoundly that they continued to influence the body even after brain death had occurred. Inspector Harwick realized that he was facing an opponent who combined the ruthless methodology of a scientist with the twisted psychology of a serial killer. Dr. Hartwell wasn't simply murdering people, he was conducting systematic research into the nature of human consciousness, using murder as his experimental method and London's elite as his unwilling laboratory subjects. The breakthrough that would finally lead Inspector Harwick to his quarry came from an unexpected source, a young medical student named Thomas Whitmore, who had attended Dr. Hartwell's lectures and become increasingly concerned about the direction of the former physician's research. Whitmore had initially been fascinated by Hartwell's theories about emotional authenticity, and had even volunteered to assist with what he believed would be harmless psychological experiments. "I thought we were engaged in legitimate scientific research," Whitmore explained, when he finally worked up the courage to contact Scotland Yard after reading about the Cavendish murder in the morning papers. Dr. Hartwell spoke eloquently about advancing our understanding of human consciousness, and I was honored to be invited to participate in his work. But as the experiments progressed, I began to realize that we were crossing ethical boundaries that no responsible scientist should transgress. The young man's account revealed the full scope of Dr. Hartwell's operation. Working from a hidden laboratory in the basement of an abandoned warehouse near the London docks, the former physician had been developing increasingly sophisticated chemical compounds designed to manipulate human emotion and consciousness. His ultimate goal was to create what he called pure emotional experience, states of feeling so intense and authentic that they transcended the social conditioning that governed normal human behavior. He had developed several different formulas, Whitmore continued, his voice shaking as he recalled the horror of what he had witnessed. Some induced overwhelming terror, others created states of profound melancholy. But his greatest achievement was the compound that produced uncontrollable euphoria. He called it his essence of joy, and claimed it could reveal the true nature of human happiness by stripping away all artificial constraints. Whitmore's description of the laboratory matched the chemical apparatus that Inspector Harwick had discovered in Dr. Hartwell's abandoned lodgings, but on a much larger scale. The basement facility contained enough equipment to produce chemical compounds in significant quantities, along with detailed records of experiments conducted on dozens of subjects over the course of several months. Most of the early subjects were volunteers from the medical schools and the workhouses, Whitmore explained. Dr. Hartwell convinced them they were participating in legitimate research that would advance scientific knowledge and potentially benefit humanity. Many of them were desperate for the small payments he offered, and they trusted his credentials as a physician. None of them understood the true nature of what they were volunteering for. But as Dr. Hartwell's experiments became more extreme and dangerous, he had been forced to seek unwilling subjects among London's more affluent population. The attendees of his lectures at the Royal Institution represented the perfect combination of intellectual curiosity and social vulnerability. Educated individuals who would appreciate the scientific significance of his work while possessing the social standing that would ensure their deaths received proper attention from the authorities. He spoke often of the need to demonstrate his theories to the broader scientific community, Whitmore recalled. He believed that by conducting his experiments on prominent members of society, he could force the medical establishment to acknowledge the importance of his research. Each death was intended as both a scientific demonstration and a challenge to conventional thinking about human consciousness. The revelation that Dr. Hartwell was using murder as a form of scientific publication horrified Inspector Harwick, but it also provided crucial information about where the killer might be found. Whitmore had provided detailed directions to the warehouse laboratory, along with information about Dr. Hartwell's habits and schedule. On a fog-shrouded evening in late December, when the thick yellow mist off the Thames had reduced visibility to mere yards, and the distant sound of ships' horns echoed mournfully across the water, Inspector Harwick received the message he had been both anticipating and dreading. A street urchin delivered an elegant envelope to his lodgings containing an invitation written in Dr. Hartwell's distinctive educated hand. "My dear Inspector Harwick," the note read, "your investigation has been most thorough and professional, though I fear you have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my work. I am not a common criminal but a scientist pursuing knowledge that will revolutionize our understanding of human consciousness. If you wish to witness the culmination of my research and understand the true significance of what I have accomplished, I invite you to join me at the Adelphi Theatre at midnight tonight. Come alone and prepare to observe the most authentic expression of human emotion ever recorded by science. Your investigation ends tonight, as does your limited understanding of what it means to be truly human. Inspector Harwick knew without question that it was a trap designed to make him the final subject in Dr. Hartwell's horrific experiments. But 3 months of fruitless investigation had left him with few alternatives, and his sense of duty demanded that he face whatever dangers lay ahead in order to prevent further murders. He made careful arrangements for backup officers to follow at a distance, armed himself with both his service revolver and a small bottle of smelling salts that might counteract chemical incapacitation, and set out through the fog-shrouded streets toward what he suspected would be his final confrontation with the Laughing Man. The Adelphi Theatre stood dark and empty on the Strand, its grand neoclassical facade casting eerie shadows in the weak gaslight that struggled to penetrate the thick fog. The stage door had been left unlocked, and Inspector Harwick found himself walking through empty corridors lined with theatrical posters advertising productions that had entertained London audiences for decades. The building seemed to echo with the ghostly memories of thousands of past performances, the very air thick with the accumulated emotions of countless actors and spectators. As he made his way toward the main auditorium, Inspector Harwick could hear voices coming from the stage. Not the single voice he had expected, but what sounded like a conversation between multiple individuals. The revelation that Dr. Hartwell was not alone sent a chill through the inspector's spine as he realized that the scope of the conspiracy might be far larger than he had imagined. He found them illuminated on the stage by a single calcium light that cast harsh shadows across the ornate proscenium arch. Dr. Sebastian Hartwell standing center stage like a lecturer addressing an invisible audience, and beside him, very much alive despite the official reports of his death, Geoffrey Cavendish. The younger Cavendish brother had not been murdered at all, but had been a willing collaborator in Dr. Hartwell's experiments from the very beginning. "Inspector Harwick?" "Dr." Hartwell called out, his voice carrying easily through the empty theatre, with the trained projection of a man accustomed to addressing large audiences. "How extraordinarily punctual of you to join our final performance. Please, do take a seat in the front row. You'll want to observe the proceedings closely, as they represent the culmination of years of scientific research into the nature of authentic human emotion. The truth, when it finally emerged in Dr. Hartwell's lengthy explanation, was more disturbing than Inspector Harwick had dared imagine. The former physician and Geoffrey Cavendish had been collaborating for over 2 years on a comprehensive program of human experimentation designed to create and study genuine emotional states under laboratory conditions. What had begun as theoretical discussions about the artificial nature of social emotion had gradually evolved into systematic murder disguised as scientific research. "The beauty of our methodology, Inspector, lies in its precision and elegance," explained Cavendish, with the chilling academic detachment of a university lecturer discussing a particularly interesting specimen. "We have succeeded in developing chemical compounds that can induce any desired emotional state while maintaining the subject's complete consciousness and awareness. Mrs. Whitfield died experiencing pure, unfiltered joy, not the polite happiness expected in social situations, but authentic euphoria divorced from any external circumstances." Dr. Hartwell stepped forward to the edge of the stage, his movements precise and calculated like a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. "Each subject has provided invaluable data about the physiological manifestations of extreme emotion. We have mapped the exact facial muscle contractions that accompany genuine terror, authentic sorrow, and, our greatest achievement, pure joy, unconstrained by social conditioning. The continued vocalizations heard after clinical death represent evidence that our compounds affect consciousness at levels far deeper than previously thought possible." The theatrical mask carved into each victim's chest, Inspector Harwick now understood, represented Dr. Hartwell's belief that all normal human emotion was mere performance, a social mask worn to meet the expectations of civilized society. Only through his chemical interventions could authentic feeling be revealed, stripped of the artificial constraints that governed proper Victorian behavior. But you have made one crucial error in your investigation, Inspector. Dr. Hartwell continued, his voice taking on the tone of a professor correcting a promising but misguided student. You have assumed that we selected our subjects randomly from my lecture attendees, when in fact, each death has been carefully orchestrated to create the perfect conditions for our ultimate experiment, the induction of authentic terror in someone who believes himself to be in control of the situation. The full horror of the trap became clear as Dr. Hartwell revealed that Inspector Harwick had not stumbled upon the killer's lair through clever detective work, but had been systematically manipulated into becoming the final test subject in their series of experiments. Every clue discovered, every witness statement recorded, every piece of evidence uncovered had been carefully planted to lead him to this moment in this place. Your colleagues at Scotland Yard have been intercepted by our associates and will not be coming to your assistance, Geoffrey Cavendish added with casual cruelty. We required a subject of exceptional intelligence and emotional control for our final demonstration, and your reputation for methodical investigation made you the perfect candidate. Your final moments will provide invaluable data about the physiological manifestations of extreme fear in a trained professional, accustomed to dangerous situations. Dr. Hartwell raised a small glass vial containing a clear liquid that seemed to glow with its own internal light in the harsh calcium illumination. This compound represents the culmination of our research, Inspector. Unlike the euphoria-inducing chemical we used on our previous subjects, this formulation will allow you to experience pure, undiluted terror while remaining completely conscious and aware of every sensation. Your death will provide the final piece of data needed to complete our understanding of authentic human emotion. But Inspector Harwick had survived 15 years of police work in London's most dangerous neighbourhoods by never underestimating his opponents and always maintaining multiple escape plans. As Dr. Hartwell descended from the stage with Geoffrey Cavendish close behind. The inspector feigned compliance and resignation while secretly preparing for a desperate gambit that represented his only hope of survival. Hidden in his waistcoat pocket was a small mirror that he routinely carried for signaling purposes during surveillance operations. As Dr. Hartwell approached with the vial of chemical compound, Inspector Harwick suddenly pulled out the mirror and used it to redirect the beam of the calcium light directly into both men's eyes, temporarily blinding them and disrupting their carefully planned assault. The struggle that followed was brief but vicious, fought out on the stage of the Adelphi Theatre, with the empty seats of the auditorium serving as silent witnesses to a battle between scientific madness and justice. Geoffrey Cavendish, despite his gentleman's education and social refinement, proved to be no match for a seasoned police officer trained in close combat. Dr. Hartwell, temporarily blinded and disoriented by the redirected light, stumbled backward toward the orchestra pit while trying to maintain his grip on the vial of chemical compound. In the end, it was Dr. Hartwell's own scientific precision that proved to be his downfall. As he fell into the orchestra pit, the glass vial shattered against the wooden flooring, releasing its contents into the air, where both he and the unconscious Geoffrey Cavendish inhaled the concentrated vapors of the terror-inducing compound that had been intended for Inspector Harwick. The arrest of Dr. Sebastian Hartwell and Geoffrey Cavendish, along with the subsequent investigation into their network of accomplices and victims, sent shockwaves through Victorian London's scientific, medical and social communities that would reverberate for decades to come. The trial, held at the Old Bailey in the spring of 1888, became one of the most sensational legal proceedings of the era, revealing the full scope of their collaborative experiments and the systematic way they had manipulated both victims and investigators in pursuit of their twisted understanding of human consciousness. The courtroom proceedings, presided over by Mr. Justice Hawkins and attended by representatives from every major London newspaper, laid bare the horrifying details of what would become known as the Laughing Man murders. Dr. Hartwell's chemical compounds were found to be far more sophisticated than anyone had initially suspected, representing a level of pharmacological knowledge that was decades ahead of contemporary medical understanding. Working with equipment stolen or purchased from various London hospitals, universities and chemical supply companies, Dr. Hartwell had created what modern science would recognize as early psychoactive drugs capable of inducing specific emotional states while simultaneously affecting motor control and cognitive function. His laboratory notes, presented as evidence during the trial, revealed systematic experimentation on human subjects that violated every principle of medical ethics and human decency. The prosecution, led by Sir Charles Russell, painted a picture of two educated men who would use their intelligence and social position to conduct systematic murder under the guise of scientific research. These defendants, Sir Charles argued in his opening statement, represent the most dangerous type of criminal, those who cloak their evil intentions in the respectable language of scientific inquiry and intellectual progress. Geoffrey Cavendish's role in the conspiracy proved to be equally crucial and far more extensive than initially suspected. His social position and financial resources had provided the infrastructure necessary for Dr. Hartwell's experiments, while his connections throughout London's cultural and intellectual circles had enabled them to identify and select suitable victims. His faked death had been accomplished through a sophisticated combination of chemical manipulation and theatrical performance that had fooled even experienced police surgeons. The trial revealed that the two men had been collaborating for nearly 3 years, beginning with theoretical discussions about the nature of human emotion and gradually evolving into systematic experimentation on human subjects. Their early victims had been drawn from London's most vulnerable populations: medical students desperate for money, workhouse residents with no family connections, and street people whose disappearances would attract no official attention. As their experiments became more sophisticated and their confidence grew, they had begun targeting members of London's upper classes who had attended Dr. Hartwell's lectures on human emotion. These victims represented both intellectual challenges and public demonstrations of their theories, designed to force the broader scientific community to acknowledge the significance of their research. The chemical compounds developed by Dr. Hartwell were studied extensively by government chemists and medical researchers, though the full results of these investigations were classified and sealed away in government archives. Some historians suggest that this early research into psychoactive substances influenced later military and intelligence applications during the Boer War and beyond, though official records regarding such uses remain classified to this day. Dr. Hartwell himself suffered irreparable damage from exposure to his own terror-inducing compound during the final confrontation at the Adelphi Theatre. The concentrated vapors that he had inhaled caused permanent psychological trauma that left him in a state of constant, overwhelming fear that no medical treatment could alleviate. During his trial, he was often unable to testify coherently, frequently breaking into uncontrollable fits of terror that required him to be removed from the courtroom. Geoffrey Cavendish suffered similar exposure to the chemical compound, but seemed to recover more completely, though he displayed periodic episodes of panic and anxiety that suggested lasting psychological damage. His testimony during the trial provided crucial details about the scope and methodology of their experiments, though he showed no apparent remorse for the suffering they had caused. The case represented a turning point in criminal investigation methods, demonstrating the need for police officers to understand not just traditional criminal motivations, but also the potential for scientific knowledge to be perverted for evil purposes. Inspector Harwick's methodical approach and willingness to pursue leads into London's intellectual community became a model for future investigations involving educated criminals who used their knowledge and social position to commit sophisticated crimes. Inspector Harwick himself was promoted to Chief Inspector following the successful resolution of the case, though the experience left lasting effects on his personal and professional life. He became one of Scotland Yard's leading experts on cases involving scientific or medical elements, consulted regularly by other police forces throughout the Empire when they encountered crimes that seemed to involve specialized knowledge. The inspector never forgot the lesson learned during his confrontation with Dr. Hartwell, that the greatest monsters often wore the faces of educated, respectable citizens who justified their actions through appeals to scientific progress and intellectual advancement. His subsequent cases frequently involved professionals who had used their specialized knowledge to commit crimes that would have been impossible for ordinary criminals to conceive or execute. The Adelphi Theatre, where the final confrontation had taken place, underwent extensive renovation following the case. Workers discovered hidden chambers beneath the stage, where Dr. Hartwell had stored chemical equipment and conducted preliminary experiments. Among the items found were detailed notes documenting each murder, plans for future victims who were never claimed, and correspondence with associates in other cities who had apparently been conducting similar experiments. Most disturbing of all was the discovery of a comprehensive list containing the names of over 50 prominent Londoners who had been selected as potential subjects for future experiments. The list included members of parliament, judges, university professors, successful businessmen, and cultural figures whose deaths would have sent shockwaves through British society. Only Inspector Harwick's successful intervention had prevented what could have become a systematic campaign of terror against London's intellectual and social elite. The warehouse laboratory near the London docks was found to contain evidence of experiments conducted on dozens of victims whose identities were never fully established. Human remains discovered in acid baths and chemical storage tanks suggested that Dr. Hartwell and his associates had been conducting their research for far longer than anyone had initially suspected, with some evidence pointing to experimental activities dating back nearly 5 years. The full extent of their network of accomplices was never completely uncovered, despite extensive investigations by Scotland Yard and other government agencies. Several individuals connected to the case disappeared before they could be arrested, suggesting that the conspiracy had ramifications that extended far beyond London and possibly into other countries where similar experimental programs might have been established. Dr. Sebastian Hartwell was sentenced to death by hanging, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment in Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum due to his obvious mental incapacity resulting from exposure to his own chemical compounds. He died in custody less than 2 years later, under circumstances that were never fully explained, though prison medical records suggest that his constant state of terror eventually caused complete cardiovascular failure. Geoffrey Cavendish received a life sentence of hard labor at Pentonville Prison, where he was assigned to work in the prison workshop, making mail bags and performing other manual labor that represented a dramatic change from his previous life of wealth and privilege. Prison records indicate that he adapted poorly to incarceration, suffering from recurring nightmares and panic attacks that frequently required medical intervention. He died in his cell in 1890, apparently from natural causes, though some fellow prisoners reported that he had been heard laughing uncontrollably for hours before his death, an eerie echo of the symptoms experienced by his former victims. The chemical formulas developed by Dr. Hartwell were never fully reconstructed, despite intensive efforts by government chemists and medical researchers. Most of his laboratory notes were deliberately destroyed during the investigation to prevent the information from falling into the wrong hands, though copies were reportedly retained by various government agencies for potential future research purposes. The case of the Laughing Man murders became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unregulated scientific experimentation and the potential for educated individuals to justify horrific crimes through appeals to intellectual progress. It influenced the development of new regulations governing medical research and contributed to the establishment of ethical guidelines that would eventually evolve into modern standards for human experimentation. Inspector Harwick's investigation methods were studied and emulated by police forces throughout the British Empire and beyond, contributing to the development of modern criminal investigation techniques that emphasize the importance of understanding the psychology and methodology of educated criminals. His detailed case notes became required reading at police training academies and influenced a generation of detectives who faced increasingly sophisticated criminal enterprises. The social impact of the case extended far beyond the immediate circle of victims and their families. London's intellectual community was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that scientific progress was not inherently virtuous and that education and social position provided no guarantee of moral behavior. The case contributed to growing skepticism about unregulated scientific research and helped fuel public support for increased oversight of medical and psychological experimentation. This mystery shows us how the Victorian era's unbridled faith in scientific progress could create an environment where educated individuals felt justified in treating human lives as mere subjects for experimentation. The pursuit of knowledge, divorced from moral consideration and ethical constraints, led to crimes that were far more horrifying than any committed by ordinary criminals motivated by greed or passion. The case reminds us that the most dangerous individuals are often those who possess the intelligence and education to rationalize their evil actions through appeals to higher purposes. Dr. Hartwell and Geoffrey Cavendish genuinely believed that their research would advance human understanding and benefit society, even as they systematically murdered innocent people in pursuit of their twisted vision of scientific progress. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that all the victims were discovered, or might there have been others whose deaths were never connected to Dr. Hartwell's experiments? The systematic nature of their research and the evidence of a broader network of accomplices suggests that the true scope of their crimes may never be fully known. Leave your comment below with your thoughts about this dark chapter in Victorian London's history. If you enjoyed this chilling tale from the gaslit streets of 1887 London and want more horror stories like this, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries. The fog-shrouded world of Victorian London holds many more secrets waiting to be uncovered, and we'll continue exploring the darkest corners of history where science and madness intersected in ways that still haunt us today. See you in the next video.